Happy Ending by H.R. Wakefield. Jonathan Turtell was absolutely, perhaps a shade self-consciously, scientifically minded. He was studying psychology under Gillivan at London University. Certain skeptics deny that psychology is or can be a science at all. Jonathan, however, had no such doubts. He was not a person who cherished many. His appearance suggested assurance of belief. High, domed brow, small, black, piercing eyes, slightly tilted fleshy nose, long, rather pouting mouth, and a chin to match this uncompromising combination. Below it, a strong, rather squat body, which brought his feet down with the resolute thumps of a man of metal. He was only 23, and aloofly and scientifically approved of what the mirror showed him. The general opinion amongst his contemporaries was that he was destined to force the world to recognize his existence in no uncertain manner. Jonathan saw no reason to debate this opinion. In a sense, his choice of lodgings in London was scientifically dictated. In his view, the law of supply and demand made it extremely improbable that there could be any very noticeable variation in comfort and cleanliness between digs in the same neighbourhood at the same price. He wished to be within a few minutes' walk to Marylebone Station, because his mother had a house near Rickmansworth, and he wanted to visit her every Sunday. So he set out from the station and rang the bell of the first respectable-looking house which had a bed-sitting-room card in the window. This happened to be number 84 of a certain street. The door was opened by a square, middle-aged female. Jonathan at once summed her up scientifically as rapacious, capable, rather sly, probably nonconformist. He stated his business and was conducted to the top floor. The room was quite satisfactory, spacious, high ceiling, light, airy, and very clean. A guinea a week was satisfactory too, and he took it for a month. "I'll bring my things along in half an hour," he said, and handed over a guinea. The whole affair had been conducted in a decisive, practical, scientific way. Exactly half an hour later he was unpacking his trunk. He then wrote to his mother, and afterwards settled down with work on behaviorism, which, Gillivan maintained, was unique in the very fact that it contained specimens of all the elementary fallacies in each of its 16 chapters. It should be said that Gillivan's opinion and Jonathan's invariably coincided. As for the other denizens of number 84, Jonathan had no concern with them, but he vaguely hoped the person next door didn't snore, for he could hear him moving about, and the wall seemed rather thin. Jonathan's regime was regular and austere. He had a light breakfast at an ABC shop, worked from 9 to 1, had a light lunch at an ABC shop, worked from 2 to 6, had dinner at a corner house, and then possibly went to a movie afterwards, for the reactions of the multitude were of huge psychological value. Then he walked back to number 84 and went to bed. He had been doing this for a week when he had the first of his odd dreams. It must have been one of the shortest on record, for it merely consisted of hearing a voice mutter, "My God! My God!" He awoke at once, its displeasing echo in his ears, displeasing because he had never heard anything uttered with such desperate melancholy. Why on earth did dreams play such tricks on one? It took him half an hour to get to sleep again, but he had forgotten all about it by the time he went to bed the following night. However, he seemed hardly to have laid his head on the pillow when it happened again. My God! My God! And then, after some uncertain interval, an odd, sharp sound which, as it were, woke him. He got up, switched on his light, and examined the room. Everything was in order. What had caused that sharp sound? It might have been, in fact, he was almost certain it had been, due to the abrupt knocking over of a light chair on an uncarpeted surface. He glanced swiftly at his own small chair by the table. It was standing firmly on its 4 slightly rickety legs. No, he had dreamed that sound. He knew it. He didn't mind realizing that, but the other, that voice, and for the second time, it might be a queer dream echo of something he'd heard recently in a film. That was probably the explanation. He sincerely hoped it wouldn't happen again, he thought, as he settled himself down to sleep. It was his experience on the next night which started to seriously worry Jonathan's mind. Once again, sleep seemed to come instantaneously, and first the voice, and then that enigmatic little crash. His dreaming consciousness became prey to a deep unease. Something unhallowed and fearful was happening in the room beyond the wall. Suddenly, there came to the dreamer's ears a rapid, dual drumming on the door of that next room, a devilish din and a horrid gasping and choking, and he awoke, and so vivid and intense had been the nightmare that still for a moment after he was awake, that vile hawking echoed in his ears. Now that was very odd, he thought, as he sat up in his bed. 3 nights running he had dreamed of sounds which he now realized had come from the next room. As a rule, he was markedly a non-dreamer. That is to say, though he knew he dreamed as everyone did, his dreams left no impression on his waking mind. He couldn't recall them having done so half a dozen times in his life. At any rate, he had never known anything remotely comparable with this, and the subject matter of these visitations was odd too. He had studied dream phenomena. He was studying it at the moment. It was an integral part of the psychological research he was undertaking, but he had never read of a case of disconnected dreamed sounds, that is to say, sounds entirely dissociated from visions. And what sounds? He was wide awake and calm now, and his habitually scientific cast of mind persuaded him, a shade reluctantly, to see if he could make sense of this sound sequence. First there was a voice, and the tone of that voice, and the remark it uttered, suggested its owner was in some urgent trouble. Well, then there was the assumed knocking over of a chair. Next, that extraordinary drumming on the door, and lastly, that peculiarly displeasing hawking and choking. Well, could one derive a coherent series out of that? It did seem to Jonathan that no one could do something along those lines. He frowned, as though the conception was unwelcomed. Some dreams, he knew, not all, but perhaps the majority, were distorted rehashes, regurgitations of some recent waking experience, physical or mental. Had anything occurred to him of late which might have given rise to having been distorted into this sequence? He could recall nothing. Then, of course, there were those other classes of dreams, but he did not propose to consider them at 2 in the morning. He must get some sleep, and he profoundly hoped it would be dreamless. It was so. The next morning, as he was dressing, he casually glanced at his door. His overcoat was hanging from a stout iron hook. He paused for a second in the act of pulling on a shoe. He cast an equally casual glance at the door of the room opposite, which was set at right angles to his room, as he was just about to set out to get his breakfast, and aloofly calculated it was just about level with the head of his bed. It may be interpolated here that Jonathan's views on the so-called supernatural were at once agnostic and dogmatic. So, it may be remarked, were those of Professor Gillivan, and he considered it the height of intellectual arrogance and egotism to deny flatly that such phenomena occurred. More than one great and sceptical scientist had devoted much of his working life and research to regarding them, and had been convinced of their occurrence, though they equally firmly asserted that they had made not the slightest progress towards discovering the causes giving rise to and controlling them. Jonathan had actually experienced at second hand one such strange thing, when his mother had rushed into his room 3 years before and said she had just seen his father standing before her, his face covered with blood, and indeed he had been accidentally killed whilst out shooting 50 miles away at just that very moment. This digression is given here to explain that Jonathan experienced a preoccupied day. His nightmare remained vividly in his memory, and he had a feeling that something was afoot, what might be called a ghostly sense that there might be more to come. His scientific curiosity was aroused, that is to say, something had happened to him for which he could find no explanation, possibly something for which no explanation could ever be found. Even if it were all over now, he knew he would remember it all his life, one of those queer little incidents which stick when many greater ones are forgotten. He got back to number 84 at 11 and went straight to bed. My God! My God! That murmur of profound despair. He listened with agonized attention. Suddenly he heard the chair go crashing down, and then that sustained and dreadful drumming, and that vile, strangling choking, and it seemed to him that he dragged himself trembling from his bed, opened the door, and crossed the passage to that other door, which was quivering and rattling violently. He had to thrust it open, for it was heavy to his hand. On the other side of it, something was swaying and jerking, something which broke loose from the door and fell heavily, enveloping him. And then he awoke, dazed and breathing heavily, hardly knowing what he was doing. He dashed to and opened his door and stood listening. There was no sound. He went back to his room, switched on the light, lit a cigarette, and sat down in his armchair. Well, what was the meaning of this? He was the subject, victim, of a recurrent and apparently developing dream, the theme of which was that someone hanged himself on the door of the room opposite. It sounded utterly fantastic, but the evidence was undeniable. His subconscious might be constructing this sequence out of some recent waking experience. He could recollect none such, but that subconscious knew better. That was the common-sense orthodox theory. But it was useless to pretend it was the only one. For example, someone might have committed suicide in that room. There was even the possibility that someone might be about to do so. He would not be the first who had experienced something of the sort. The evidence for that was also irrefutable, but what to do about it? Clear out was the obvious answer. He knew he couldn't stand any more repetitions of this highly unnerving ordeal. But what would be the point in his doing so? Now here the scientist voiced a protest. What every scientist longed for, especially young ones, was to make the personal contribution to the cause of science. Should he eschew and run away from this thing? But Coldfoot replied, "There is nothing new in experience. It is nebulous and unrelated. The evidence for such dreamlike sequences may be undeniable, but 990 scientists out of 1,000 would believe you were a thundering liar if you published your experience. After all, you are a psychologist, not a psychic. And what about your health, especially mental health? It might easily become a disintegrating obsession." Well, he would consult Gillivan about it, he decided. It would take some courage, but he would do it. The great man appeared to approve of him, and he would chance it. He went back to bed, and his slumbers were troubled no more. So he went up to the professor after his afternoon lecture the next day, and asked if he might have a word with him. "Something urgent. I'm very busy tonight. What is it about?" Jonathan did a genuine blush, one of the first of his existence. A dream sequence, sir." "What, your own?" smiled the professor. "Yes, sir. I'm in a difficulty, and I wanted your advice." "Come to my room at 8 tomorrow evening, and you shall have it." As he dined, Jonathan wondered what his next and last, very possibly, in number 84, would have in store for him. For example, had the sequence ended, or was there another scene to be played, and if that were so, would he then be left in peace? He realized what incredulous derision these speculations would arouse in probably everyone else in the little restaurant. But they hadn't known what he had. These questions in no way seemed absurd to him, nor would they, he felt convinced, to Richer, Gellé, or Donne. He was feeling quite cheerful and resigned as he walked home. On reaching it, he decided to read for a while. Presently he looked at his watch, 1:15, and then his lips parted slightly. His eyes grew staring, and he became quite rigid, for he had heard the voice of one doomed murmur, "My God, my God!" "I'm going mad," thought Jonathan desperately. That was an oral hallucination. Waking and dream world have become one, and that is madness. With an effort he rallied his spirit, and, flashing to his memory, came a little story by Gillivan of how a doctor in charge of some cases of botulism, an inevitably fatal infection, of which a prominent symptom is double vision, had gone into the kitchen of the hotel and had seen two cooks standing side by side. In a flash he knew that he too was doomed, and felt other symptoms stirring to life within him. But it had only been the cook's twin sister. Suddenly there came that other sound, as of a chair sent wildly sprawling, and then, following hard, that hellish tattoo was drummed on the door of the room opposite, and then the horrid gasping of a strangling man. Then Jonathan understood. He dashed to the door of that other room. He had to thrust it open, for it was heavy to his hand. Something was tossing and writhing there, something that swayed down, enveloping him. He broke loose, dashed to the wall, searching for the light switch, found it, and there, On the floor, an overturned chair beside him, was one with eyes staring from their sockets, tongue stretched horribly, and an old blue tie clamped around his neck. "Extremely interesting," said Gillivan. "And the young man, he recovered?" "Yes, sir, and he spends his time cursing me." "I suppose they have put him in a cell?" "Yes. Isn't it a damned shame?" "Well, theoretically, yes. Practically, don't you believe it, they seldom jail them. I suppose it was money?" "Well, yes." "Yes, well, he needn't worry about that any more, need he? He has drawn his attention to the plight, and the charitable will do the rest. If I were hopelessly broke, I'd stage a fake, unsuccessful suicide. He'll live to bless you." "Tell me, sir," said Jonathan, "is there any explanation of this sort of thing? It seems so urgent, and yet so purposeless." "Did you ever read Modern Metaphysics by Sir Anstruther Sawbridge?" "No." "Few have, though it's a monumental work. I'll lend you my copy. He holds that every event exists eternally and universally. The first man on Mars might have seen, the last man on Earth may yet see, your friend drop as that hook went, but only if they were privileged or accursed, persons called clairvoyants. Sawbridge is markedly one, apparently, and equally apparently you are another. An attempt to divine a clairvoyant results in a vicious circle. It is an ingenious little theory, well worthy of your scrutiny and criticism." "Why, it certainly never occurred to me that I was clairvoyant," said Jonathan. "Well, don't feel uppish about it. But Sawbridge states that clairvoyants are often rather below the general level of intelligence.